Welcome, everybody. My name is David Nash. I'll be the moderator for this session. So I'd like to welcome you to a discussion about new parking standards. Firstly, I'd just like to do an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, the ITE-ANZ acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. We acknowledge and respect the Treaty of Waitangi and the Maori people as the original people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So welcome very much to all of you for coming along. Just a little bit about the ITE. The ITE is a very large organisation throughout the world with over 17,000 members in 75 countries. The membership is mostly in North America, and we're a bit of an outpost here in Australia and New Zealand. New members are always welcome to the organisation. I'd like to acknowledge our sponsors. A list of our sponsors is there on the screen. All of them contribute to our organisation and allow us to run these sorts of webinars, which are of interest to the profession. And in our case, free of charge, which is very useful for those people who want to get extra learning. So to today's session, we have two very good speakers to talk about new parking standards. Wes and Oleg are both members of the CE001 Committee of the Australian Standards and are heavily involved in the standards for parking facilities. So I'll introduce both of them first and then hand over to Oleg to start the session. Wes is the director of Arrive, which is a consulting practice he started in 2002. He's a member of the ITE and of Engineering New Zealand. He's a fellow there. And he's also a chartered professional engineer in New Zealand. He's got 39 years of engineering experience, with 32 of those years specialising in traffic engineering and transport planning. Wes has experience in the design of traffic infrastructure, including parking facilities. Oleg is also a consultant. He's the founding director of TEF Consulting, a traffic engineering and transport planning firm established in 1996. He is a member of Engineers Australia and a fellow of the AITPM. Oleg served as a member of the New South Wales and ACT Committee of the AITPM from 1998 to 2002 and was twice elected president of that branch. With 40 years of experience in traffic engineering, Oleg initially specialised in vehicle safety and crash reconstruction, but he's expanded his expertise into design of traffic and parking facilities and transport planning and modelling, general road safety, which are now his primary focus of areas. So I'll hand over now to Oleg to start discussing new parking standards.
Thank you, David, and greetings to everyone. Today's session is about the new standards, part one, which is off-street car parking general standard, which is currently in preparation, and part six, which is off-street car parking for people with disabilities, which was published in November 2022. So we'll also touch upon that. As you probably know, there are other parts of the standards which we talk about briefly later. If you could just move on to the next slide. So the introduction, I guess next slide from here. What about a standard generally? Australian standards and New Zealand standards, or joint ones, they documents which contain the requirements and recommendations on in our case, in car parking design. And what needs to be known is that they are not legislation, they're not legislation documents, they're not policies, and nor they are a design guideline, which many people think they are, but they're not. So it is a document which basically collects the best practice and recommends what needs to be done to make the design workable, but it cannot be used as a design guideline. Therefore, the important thing is that the compliance with the standard does not mean that you would have a workable or suitable design. It will give you the minimum parameters, which would guarantee that most things will work, but necessarily when you put them all together. Therefore, any designer who uses the standards should exercise duty of care and be aware of possible litigation. In the litigation process, standard helps a lot, obviously, and it is often, and if not always, relied upon by the courts in making their judgments, because people do refer to the standard in litigation. Therefore, they're very important documents. So we move on to next slide. We have currently in the parking facilities, we have 5 standards. The one we're talking about today, Wes will be talking about number 1, which is currently under review. Part 2 is commercial vehicle facilities, which was updated in 2018. We have a very comprehensive bicycle parking standard, part 3 of the same series. On-street parking, which was updated recently as well in 2020, and the part 6, which was updated in 2022. It used to be a joint standard, Australian New Zealand standard, published in 2009. The current version is Australian standard only. As I understand, New Zealand still goes by the 2009 version. Now, about the update process. So what happens and how all this works. Requests are received from members of the public and organizations, from professionals. People write to Standards Australia or Standards New Zealand about their concerns with the current standards, saying, well, there's something there which doesn't look right or needs updating with the time as things change. And this will be one of the reasons why we started looking at updating part 1, which Wes will talk about. The committee is then given all that correspondence, and the committee sits and decides on whether they justify updating the standard, because it is a substantial work required to do that. Standards Australia and Standards New Zealand decide on funding this work. You probably need to be aware that the committee works there free. We do not get paid or volunteers, but it still requires funding because there is lots of internal work and editing in the standards, Australia and Standards New Zealand. The working group is set up. That working group would be a group of professionals from different organizations and representatives of interested bodies. Then the working group spends time to prepare the draft, going through all the correspondence, the concerns, and working out the new solutions, or updating the standard, changing, correcting mistakes if there are. Once the draft is prepared, it goes out for public consultation. For part 1, that consultation was completed in Australia, and we already went through the review of the public comments, but it's only started in New Zealand. So once that's done and all the public comments are reviewed and necessary changes are made in the draft standard, then the final document is published, and that becomes the current standard. And the next slide. So about the next slide, please, David. Yep. About the Standards Australia Committee, it has the name CE001 parking facilities. There are many committees in the Standards Australia and New Zealand looking after all sorts of standards. Members are nominated by different organizations, by local government and state road authorities, industry associations, special interest groups. For example, I have been nominated and I represent Engineers Australia on the committee, and Wes represents Engineering New Zealand. And we also have people from authorities and associations. So this is how all that works. And now I'll pass on to Wes to talk about the draft Australian New Zealand Standard Part 1.
Thanks, Oleg. Right, I'll talk about Part 1, which is, as Oleg said, currently in draft. The final document in its current form is currently confidential to the committee. So Oleg and I can talk about what's in the draft. We can talk generally about some of the comments we've received. We can talk about some of the reasons why things have changed so far, but we can't tell you what the final content is yet. So the draft of Part 1 was initially focused on those change requests that were received. There were quite a number of flow-on changes in this case. So most parts of the standard we've had a look at, but there are parts that we have left alone because we had no queries or comments to change those. We have grouped all of the gradient requirements together, so hopefully that they are easier to find. And of course, we've updated all the references to be the current ones. And there have been a lot of editorial changes due to the way that Standards Australia now likes things to be. So initially, a very big part of the work that we did was looking at design vehicles. The last standard was produced in 2004, and we had a lot of comments noting that it appeared to a lot of professionals that the fleet had been increasing in size. So we did some fleet surveys based on some initial data provided from Queensland, and that gave us enough confidence to say, yes, we think we need to do a more comprehensive survey. So for New South Wales, Oleg led the effort to review the dimensions of all vehicles registered in New South Wales. I led the effort to do the same thing for all vehicles registered in New Zealand. And we both got to about 94% of a very similar sized fleet. We did our analysis completely independently and separately, and our results were effectively the same. So the B85 design vehicle that most of you will be familiar with has been unchanged. It was very nearly or exactly the same size as the existing B85. As part of updating the standard, the dimensions of the vehicle have been rounded up or rounded to 1 decimal place, and that's effectively also addressed what we saw in the fleet surveys. We haven't made any changes to any of the dimensions that flow from the B85. So the B99 design vehicle, we found it to be longer and wider. We also found that the minimum turning radius had increased. And interestingly enough, the vehicle is now the 99.0 percentile vehicle, whereas in the current standard it's 99.8. Part of the reason for the larger vehicle appears to be largely due to the increased popularity of vehicles such as double cab utes. We found that they had a fairly significant influence because of their popularity. So in calculating the percentiles, it is weighted by the number of each vehicle. And as part of the discussion, we had quite a lot of discussion around selecting the appropriate B99 vehicle with respect to what vehicles to include or exclude, particularly about vans. And you'll see there is some discussion in Appendix A about the vans that were included and the vehicles that were excluded. So Section 1 of Part 1 is about scope and general items. We have 7 new definitions. Some of these arterial road, etc., have been in the standard for a long time, but referred to other documents for the definition. So we've now brought those within the standard, which is particularly helpful for New Zealanders. And one of the other big changes is the user class. It forms a key and fundamental part of how the standard works. And obviously the first one is selecting the different parking dimensions. So for the 2004 standard, the inputs to the user class are the required door opening, and the second one is the required aisle width and the maneuvering. And that gives you an output of classes 1, 1A, 2, 3, 3A, and 4. In discussing this, committee felt that most people started in the examples column to determine what the user class was, and the door opening and aisle width were sort of there for information. So we thought we could potentially restructure that. And so in the draft, you will see the inputs are now a familiarity, user allocated or unallocated parking, and the parking duration, which is related to the turnover of the parking spaces. And you have output classes 1 to 5. So in the top right corner, if you have user allocated parking for more than 5 hours, so it's low turnover staff parking, that type of thing, you user class 1 as you were before. In the bottom left, if it's high turnover unallocated parking, for example, at a shopping centre, you would end up with user class 5. I will note that the final draft has responded to comments. We got quite a few comments on the way this was structured, and we have made some changes. I just can't tell you what they are yet. Section 2 is parking modules, and because of the change in the B99, the parking spaces are now 200 millimetres longer at 5.6 metres. Where a space is between two obstructions, for example, between two columns, there are now minimum widths specified, and they are increased. We've made some changes to the motorcycle parking dimensions, and that was primarily founded on some British standards and guidelines. And in the 2004 edition, New Zealand had its own different dimensions for the small car space. That's now been made the same as the Australian small car space. We've had a look at the physical controls section, and we have a new heading, separators, and we have raised medians, flush medians, and flexible delineators. That essentially allows us to set requirements for how wide any separator needs to be, depending on its type. So circulation on curbs, the ramp and curve widths and radii have both increased, and that's to account for the new B99. Access and queuing section, and 3.2.4 is site distance to roads at access locations. So the distances in the table have been updated. We use the latest data from the Austroads guidelines, which have been based on new research undertaken since 2004. We've expanded the table to go down to 30 kilometres an hour frontage road speed. Another thing that we've done is we've graduated the distance requirements. So at a low volume, low turnover driveway on a low volume, low speed road, the requirement is ASD, or approach site distance, which is consistent with the Austroads guidelines. At the other end of the scale, for busy high volume car parks on busy high volume, high speed roads, we require the full Austroads safe intersection site distance, so ASD that should read. Because of that graduation, we've now removed the domestic values, and we fixed up a small error in the current standard where sometimes the desirable distances were less than the minimums. Most of you will be familiar with this diagram about site distance to paths. It's well known and commonly used. That's been changed now. In the draft, we have based the requirements on path user speed, similar to what we've done for road users for a long time. And that's because there are increasing use of paths on the roadside for scooters and cyclists. We've provided some definitions about what size obstruction in the visibility triangle can be tolerated. And this work's been based on some Queensland and some New Zealand work into this. So we now have a diagram in the draft that looks something like this, where we have an X distance and a Y distance that vary. Ramps and gradients, as I said, have been grouped together, but there's no significant changes to the requirements in that section. So section 5 is called Other Considerations. And we've now said that access should be separate from vehicle access, pedestrians access, and we've required pedestrian paths to be provided for busier routes. So if there's a fairly high demand for pedestrians to share a high volume, high speed circulation route used by vehicles, you now have to provide a path. In the signs and marking sections, there are now slip resistance requirements for pedestrian crossing markings. There was a New Zealand exemption that in New Zealand we were allowed to mark our lines at 5 meters long instead of 5.4. Now both countries have to mark them at 5.6, and we've updated sign references. Parking structures has had quite a bit of attention. In the manoeuvring, same as in 2004, there is a maximum of 3 movements for the B85 to enter and exit a parking space. We've added that that's now a maximum of 5 movements for the B99, which was implied before but never clear. And we've clarified that this is the total for the in and the out movements. The parking space envelope that you're probably familiar with is now 200 millimeters longer because of the change in the B99, and we've expanded that in the middle where the door opening section is. The 2004 had some content for garages and other enclosed spaces. That's been expanded and reviewed. We now have garages and cages considered together. There are some changes to minimum widths, and there is a new minimum length when the space is enclosed on both ends, as a garage or a cage would normally be. And the length varies depending on whether you need to be able to move from one side of the vehicle to the other. So the intention is that you can walk around a car parked inside a garage without having to open the garage door. There's now a section on vehicle lifts and hoists. There's minimum dimensions for the enclosed space, and there are passing and queuing requirements at the entry and exit to those systems. Mechanical parking has also been addressed. We now have standards included for car stacking, and we've separated that into user-operated stacking machines and fully automated systems. And we've added some requirements for turntables. Just a note here that user-operated car stackers and turntables are in the standard can only be used for user classes 1 and 2. So the appendices is probably overlooked by many, but there's quite a lot of information in here. Appendix A is the vehicle characteristics, and this talks about the fleet dimension survey that we did. So this has been updated, and this section also talks about how some of the dimensions in the standard have been derived. Appendix B is normative, which means it forms part of the requirements of the standard. And this is about the base dimensions of the vehicles. Now, a key change is that the 2004 standard has turning swept path templates that you can photocopy and use. The committee felt that that was outdated, and we have provided and actually now require the use of swept path software for horizontal movements, and we have provided a dimensions table so to provide all the information that that software requires. And table looks like this, and that should be all the inputs you need to undertake swept path analysis. Appendix C is the vertical clearance section. This is reasonably unchanged, although we have now provided for software analysis, and the ground clearance template, the manual template, is still provided, and it has been updated because of the change in the dimensions in the design vehicles. Appendix D is capacity at entry and exits. It provides guidelines for the flow rates that you can expect for different types of control, and we have added a rate for automatic number plate recognition systems as they are becoming more common. And just to note that there are further changes coming to this section because of the comments that we have received. Appendix E provides the background on visibility splays at exits, and this is for the pedestrian sight lines, and provides some of the derivation of the path sight distance. So the comments for Australia were closed, and a consultation for New Zealand is currently ongoing until the 22nd of November. The Australian comments, we received 1,183 comments. 9% of those were editorial and 9% were general. 35% of the comments we received were technical. And 47%, nearly half of the comments we received were about the increase in the size of the parking space and to fit the new B99. Various views expressed on that. As I said, the New Zealand consultation is currently open to New Zealanders only, and we'll process those comments. So if you're in New Zealand, please go to the Standards New Zealand website and put your comments in. And I'll hand over to Oleg to cover part 6.
Thank you, Wes. Right, part 6. So it's been published already. No further comments or changes for now. Going to the introduction. In the introduction to the standard, the next slide, please. We have, this one. Normative references. That was just primarily editorial change. On that first page of the standard, you had a list of other standards and guidelines referred to, but they were basically just for informative purposes, and therefore they were all moved into the bibliography section. However, there are 2 documents which are now listed as references because they're normative. In the current version of the standard, they're now better aligned with standards AS 1428.1, which is designed for access and mobility, part 1, general requirements for access and new building work, which are mostly used by accessibility specialists. So we thought that they needed to align better. It wasn't that well done in the previous version of the standard. And also there is a direct reference to standard 4586, which is slip resistance classification of new pedestrian surface materials. Again, the reference to that standard was made because there was no such requirement in the 2009 version, and because these requirements could change in standard 4586. So rather than, we did copy the numbers, but still reference was made for any future changes in this standard. So you can use that directly. There were quite a few new and amended definitions, mostly to make sure that they align with the accessibility standard requirements. Shade area was explained a bit better. Next one, please. Many changes made in parking space layout and access. Location of accessible space is now defined, which wasn't in the 2009 version. So distances to the accessible pedestrian entry. The shade area, again, better definition, more explanation how that should work. The important change was in terms of the zone for bollards, posts, and columns. Previously, there was just a location of a bollard to prevent parking in the shade area. Now it is a zone which allows to use other structures like posts and columns, which was quite a strong demand from the users of the standard. That's why there was a change. Next one. We had improved dimensional requirements for dimensions of parking spaces, made some corrections in figures, and provided quite a few examples of layouts to help designers use the standard in terms of how it's organized. And we just go to a couple of slides showing what they are. So you can see in these examples on the left, for example, that red rectangle, that's a zone where you could place a bollard or a column. It does allow for placing a structural column. It's from memory 400 millimeters in width and a meter in length. And it shows on top there is an accessible travel path. In this particular case, it has inline ramps, pram ramps or curb ramps, but there are other examples for accessible path, travel paths being in the same level with car parking spaces or different level, and how it can be all organized, and with the ramp being in shade area. An example is given for a layout where you have two dedicated spaces near the corner of the car park. Next slide. What wasn't in the previous standard is angle parking. So there's a section on that one as well, and how it can be organized for two-way traffic and one-way traffic. Next one. What I mentioned previously, requirements for slip resistance. In the 2009 version of the standard, it simply says the area for both the car parking space and the shared area shall be slip resistant, but didn't define what it is. And there was quite a bit of a debate between professionals when it came to the application of the standard. So this is now sorted. It should be quite clear. Next one. Big changes in the headroom requirements. So we went away from the blank requirement of 2500 millimeters headroom above the spaces, because it's not really required operationally. Only the area in the middle, where if you have a vehicle with the wheelchair stored on top of the vehicle, would require that kind of height. But it is not necessary for the front and the rear of the space. So we decided that a bit of relaxation needs to be given in this area. This is based on the extensive research primarily done by Mark Rell, who is a very well-known accessibility consultant. Next one, please. So that was a side view and what it looks from the front. So in the middle again, you can have a 2.2 meter clearance, which would help with a lot of with the design of the car park in many cases. Next one. The space identification. The new part of the standard is talking about residential for privately owned parking spaces and private garages, that pavement markings are no longer required. It wasn't clearly defined in the previous standard. So in a private garage, you don't have to mark your space, even if you use it for a person with a disability. And some improvements to definition requirements for pavement markings in a few sections in these sub-clauses. Next one, and the appendices. There's a clause on drop-off zones, which is to allow for taller vehicles, some taller vehicles, to come through to the site. So there's an explanation and definition of those, and a lot of explanation of on how what on the requirements, operational requirements for people, drivers and passengers with a mobility impairment when they use wheelchairs to get from the side or from the rear, and how it generally works. So to help the designers understand when they use the standard. And we had access control entry requirements previously in the 2009 version, which is basically where to have a put button or the card slot when you have a vehicle with a disabled person inside at the entry to the car park. It should be so now. That's been moved to part 1, which provides general requirements in this regards, including for people with disabilities. And I think that would be the end of that. And ready for questions.
Super. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. You've prepared well for this. So now comes the hard part of the hard questions. So firstly, let's just address the question of height. Ted asks, has the height of vehicles changed? Small cars are often over 1.5 metres tall, especially SUVs. Is there any change to height requirements?
No.
We have to provide for the same for the tallest vehicles anyway on the travel path. So that hasn't changed. That's 2.2 meters. The 85 vehicle has been defined in the table. I don't remember now, 1.7 or 1.8. There's no specific provision for small car spaces in terms of the height. So again, the Australian standard is not a mandatory document. It is a best practice, basically. So if a designer can prove that a particular space can be treated differently with certain precautions, that is still possible.
Okay,
Yes,
and then there are
anything?
also a few questions about the width. If the B99 is 200 millimeters longer, it's 200 millimeters wider, is there any change to the width of parking bays?
No. No. A lot of the width is determined from being able to maneuver in and out of the space and to be able to open the doors. So a small width in the increase of the B99 hasn't resulted in the width of the parking spaces changing.
Okay, as Lee points out, you've got to be a fairly skinny person to get out of a 2.1 metre wide vehicle if the space is only 2.4 metres. Can you explain a bit more of the logic about why you haven't increased the width in the standard?
You've never should be putting a 2.1 metre car in a 2.4 metre wide space, because you should always have at least another 300 millimetres provided either in the next parking space, or you have to provide extra space if you're up against an obstruction like a wall. It could still be a bit tight if you happened to be parked next to another B99, but the chances of that are fairly small.
Extremely small. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair enough. Okay, so the big elephant in the room, which is probably where you got many of the comments about encouraging the proliferation of car bloat. As Dylan points out, by making the parking spaces larger, makes it more appealing for urban dwellers to buy and regularly use excessively large vehicles. Should we not be keeping parking bays at their current size in order to discourage any further bloat? I imagine that many of the comments that you received were along those lines. What's been your philosophical response to that?
Okay, I can start.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of discussion on that, and you're right, almost half of the comments were related to this in some way. At the end of the day, Standards Australia is not a policy organisation, and we felt that if there was to be some change in regulating the size of vehicles, that had to come from central government or in Australia, federal government level. They haven't addressed that, and we don't feel it's our place to put that into the standard.
Yeah. But also, essentially, the way the standards work, it's quite the opposite. The standard is not issued to encourage or discourage people to do something. It is based on the changes in the environment and what actually happens out in the field. And then we have requests like saying, okay, well, what we have right now, the old standard, it no longer works because things change. So it's the other way around. We look at the current fleet, which is different from what we had 20 years ago, and we see that there are vehicles there which are bigger, longer, and we have to provide for those. That's how the standard works. We provide the designers with the minimum requirements, dimensions, to make it work for what is currently there, not to encourage and discourage for future and what people do. And mind you, we do have the increase in these larger vehicles at the moment, and having the standard which was in place for 20 years with smaller spaces, well, didn't discourage anybody. So it's not how it works. If we want to introduce a policy to discourage people from using larger vehicles, I personally don't like them either. They make me and my smaller car, suffer when I get to park in the car park. It is to be done through different channels, like for example, government taxes on larger vehicles, something like that. But it's not the place of the standard to do that.
Fair enough. A specific question from Peter: does the Part 6 standard space length increase to accommodate the new B99 vehicle?
No, it actually not, because the problem with that is the standard Part 6 was published before the work on Part 1 started. So we are yet to figure out how it's going to be handled. We're going to discuss that within the committee and with Standards Australia and New Zealand, and most likely there will be either an errata or addendum issued for all other parts, because they all were based like Part 5 as well, for street parking. I'm not sure how that would work as well, because that's all based on the previous size of vehicle. So something will be done in the near future, I presume.
Okay, and another good question from Justin about how all this is promulgated. Will there be some sort of guiding document with the changes to the revised standards and summarising the key changes, or you're just putting out the standard and hope that everyone reads the detail?
Yeah, I think there is an introductory part of the standard that explains what's changed. But yeah, we do hope people read it.
Yeah. In short, if you go to like Part 6, page 4, which is a preface, it says the major changes in this edition are as follows, and A, B, C, D, and so on, and they're all listed there.
This is a question from me, just following up on that. Is there a role, do you think, for the institutes, the AITPM, Engineers Australia, Engineers New Zealand, to help sort of get the message out there that this has changed?
Well, it is happening. We are conducting seminars and webinars like this one. With my other Australian colleague, I conducted probably 3 or 4 seminars through the AITPM. Wes was just saying that he conducted another one just recently. Yes.
And if you'll have us back, we're happy to do another one after the final has been published.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good idea.
And I know
okay.
our other colleagues doing the same through their organizations. Yes.
That's good. So a more specific question from Will. Wouldn't 3 movements when reversing out of a car space end in vehicle reversing? Isn't the total number of movements for a correction when reversing out of a car space 4 in total?
We've had lots of discussions about this because even within the working group, we've had different understandings of what it means. So we will be adding a bit of clarification to hopefully make it clearer. But the idea is if you drive into a parking aisle, you then reverse into a parking space, and then you drive out in one movement, that's a total of 3 movements is how we've counted it. So think perhaps we should probably add a diagram because it's something that keeps coming up.
Right. Faisal is wondering if the Austroads vehicle library in vehicle tracking software will be updated to reflect the changes in dimensions. You might not know the answer to that question, but it's worth asking in case you do know.
I'd expect the software providers would do that. Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off.
That's all right. No, I was going to say the same. And yes, the Austroads updated their library not so long ago, from what I remember, maybe beginning of this year. I guess we just probably need to write them and say, look, have a look at the new standard. I'm sure they will, because they, just like our committee, we look at all the documents and guidelines which are of use and interest to us.
Okay, here's another question about the Victorian planning scheme. So in Victoria, most car parks are based on the planning scheme, which is 4.9 metres by 2.6 metres with 6.4 metre aisles. Upgrading to a new disability standard, particularly with respect to length at 5.4 metres, can be difficult and costly if the entire car park has to be modified. So how would you address that concern?
Victorians are quite defined. Well, it is. I would say that's not really our concern. It's a concern for Victorian government how to deal with that. Again, this standard provides requirements and recommendations as to what needed to be done in terms of design to have a workable, comfortable car parking space, and whether the government accepts it or not, it's really up to them.
I'd also add this: the standard wouldn't have any effect retrospectively. So if you've got an existing parking facility that was designed to the 2004 standard, I would expect it not to have to be updated.
Yeah, I think that's probably the key point. So another question here, noting that Appendix B, which is normative, states that design dimensions are based on the B85 vehicle and they should be limited to manoeuvring in parking spaces and parking aisles. Could the standard be more elegantly written to nominate a percentage of parking bays to be designated for B99 rather than the mandate for 100% of spaces being B99?
Yeah, this is something that has come up several times and something that we did discuss. The standard does provide for a small car space. It does not say how many of those you should have or are allowed to have. And unlike a small car space, if a big car parks in a small car space, the small car that comes along could go and park anywhere else. The same is not true if you are driving a large car. And one of the difficulties is A, how many of those spaces to provide, and B, how do you stop other cars from parking in a large car only space? So we haven't made any calls on the number of those spaces. We found that to be too problematic.
It's very problematic because then you need to think about the user class, whether the car park is private or public, and the size of the car park. If you say design or define requirement for B99 car spaces, be whatever percent, 2% of the car park, how do you deal with the 10 space car park? It's becoming hugely complicated, and frankly speaking, is not something the design standard should be dealing with. This is a design standard. Even what that's mentioned for small car spaces, we're not saying how many should be there. We're saying, look, if you provide for a small car, well, this is the minimum requirements. But going into the area where how many and what percentage, it's not really something which can be done in this scope.
Yeah. A question from Aaron. Do you know if there's any transition period to the new standards, particularly for projects that are in progress at the moment? It'll have a big impact on projects currently being designed. How do people deal with that when there's an impending new standard?
It comes down to whoever's requiring the standard to be followed. And I expect most of them would adopt a grace period and say, well, we're going to make the new standard effective from this date.
Well, I know the local government in Australia in particular generally goes by with the developed applications, for example, they go by the date when you submit your development application, and that's on the side of the older standard. Then you'll be going through the whole process up to the occupational certificate on the same standard. Nobody will be requiring you to change the design midway. So that would be the usual practice.
Yeah. Another question about electric vehicles. So have recharging facilities been considered with the size of parking spaces?
Yeah, we talked to the standards committee responsible for electric car chargers and asked them, can you provide us a standard size for charging equipment? And they said no. It's just too variable. So we couldn't really allocate or put anything like that in the standard. So effectively, if it's outside the column clearance template diagram, then it's okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's another question about manually operated car stackers. So is the standard height clearance maintained at the aisle accessible space where occupants may need to move around the vehicle, with height clearance for vehicles in storage spaces not accessible to occupants, reduced to the minimum required to accommodate the vehicle form? That's a question from Chris there, which is quite a long question, but do you understand what he's getting at there?
My understanding is, so if a person with a disability arrives to and needs to use a car stacker, so they have to disembark from the vehicle to start with in the parking aisle. Is that the idea? And then the headroom, which is 2.2 minimum in a parking aisle, may not be enough for that if you have a wheelchair stored on the top of the vehicle. Is that what it is about?
That's a good question.
Get a clarification, because my understanding that's what it is about, and no, I don't think we provided for that, and it's a good question, really. Something needs to be looked into.
A question from Robin. How small is a small car, or how big is a small car? Shopping centre car parks use the term small car. Does anyone know what size of vehicle they're referring to?
It's in Appendix A, and I think there was some confusion. There might have been a typo in the standard. I think in one of the earlier editions it was 30-something percentile, I think.
The fifth percentile or something, yeah, it was, yeah.
Yep, okay.
I did look at those dimensions for a number of projects, what they actually are, the small car space, and a Mazda 3 would be a very good example.
Yeah, so it's the 50th percentile.
Yeah, and that's Mazda 3 fits pretty much to less than 1% margin in all dimensions.
Yeah. Okay, look, there's a few other comments there. Some of them are sort of building on the previous comments, and maybe some of those comments and discussions could go offline. I can provide all of that to our two presenters, and they can engage in emailed correspondence if necessary. But look, I might bring things to a close and thank our two speakers for excellent presentation on a very important topic. And we've had nearly 200 people online, so it's been obviously of considerable interest to a lot of people in the profession. Just to finish off, I'd like to just mention a couple of things that are happening within the ITE-ANZ. We've got our President's Dinner coming up next week on Tuesday night. So if you haven't booked already, this is a great event to come along to if you're in Melbourne. So there are the details there. That's on Tuesday, the 19th of November. But also on that same day, there is at lunchtime another webinar run by the young ITE members. It'll be about the SAFE system presented by Ken Beer. So that will also be an interesting seminar. So again, I thank our two speakers for an excellent presentation, a lot of interest, a lot of discussions there about some small matters about parking bay sizes and more important issues of policy, which is very interesting also. So I'd like to thank our two speakers. Thank you for attending and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks to all those who attended.